It's my great privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Will Davies, and he's going to talk to us about his research based on his publication, Secret and Special, the untold story of the Z Special Unit in the Second World War. And we're going to hear about this highly secret Special Operations Unit known as Z Special Unit. Its operational areas included Papua New Guinea, Timor, Borneo, Sarawak, the Molucca and Celebes, Singapore, and even Indochina. Will's book covers the majority of the operations of the Special Operations Australia between 1942 and late 1945. Now, Will holds a PhD from the Australian National University. He started work at the Commonwealth Film Unit in 1972, and he's worked at the BBC and Hollywood in the 1970s before he set up his production company, Look Films Productions. And it was one of the most prolific documentary production companies between 1983 and 2003. Will retired in 2010 for making documentaries, but of course he hasn't retired. He's been writing books. He's written 10 books. And one of the documentaries that many of you will have seen, I'm sure, which he made was When the War Came to Australia, which is about the bombing of Darwin. That's for another day, but I'm sure we'd love to hear about that as well. But without further ado, I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Will Davies, today's guest speaker.
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you for having me. The quick overview of this history is that, first of all, it was very secret. From the time that it was operational right through into the late 80s, many of those files were hard to open, hard to get access to, and I found this, in fact, when I was working on that series, When the War Came to Australia. I'll get to that in a minute. But what's important to understand is that this is quite a complex story. It's the organisation had a number of names. Men were recruited from all the three services, but also from the British, the New Zealanders. There were Dutch, Portuguese, Americans, different Asian countries, different tribal groups. Now, it came together, and during its operational time, there was somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 operatives under this broad term of Z Special. Now, I want to clarify this because the Z Special Unit was simply an administrative name. It was part of a fairly complex group of organisations. Initially, Special Operations Australia. It became the Services Reconnaissance Department, but I've used Z Special Unit simply on the cover of the book and in talking about it because that's what people know. They know that common name. They don't know Special Operations Australia, if they know anything at all, even if they know anything about the Z Special Unit. So please excuse me for using that. I've been criticised on a number of fronts because I use it and it's really only an administrative name. Now, the other thing I want to clarify is that this is, I've said on the title of the book, it's an untold story. It is an untold story to a broader audience. This is a very general readership book. It's not for academics or it's not for the specialists in the area. It's simply to expose a history that covers about 84 raids over about 4 years, and trying to cram that into 80,000, 100,000 words, you've got to be fairly sort of go across the top of this history and not get too deep. It's also important for me that it's a readable, accessible history. So while other books have been written about it, many of them have been written about operatives, about their own operation. They've had limited distribution, certainly limited readership. And I guess if you probably went into any library, apart from the War Memorial Library, you'd have trouble finding a copy. So again, I just want to clarify this use of the fact that it's untold. Now, people ask me, how did I get involved in this history? And this goes back really to when I was a kid. I was about 14 when I read Ron McKee's book, The Heroes. And this was a story of the raid on Singapore, the Jaywick raid with the Krite. And it was pieced together by interviews with some of the survivors, the operatives. And I mean, again, it's been criticised since then because it's got holes in it or people weren't telling the truth or whatever. But that's where I started. Now, I then went on to make this series that Christine mentioned called When the War Came to Australia. This is just the cover of the book of the series. But when I was doing that, I remember this Jaywick story, and I thought I'll go to the National Archives of Australia and see what I can find. I was fortunately given title reference numbers to the files I needed. So I went across to the Mitchell archive of the NAA, and I'd sent ahead the files I wanted. When I got there, the files were piled up on this desk, and behind the desk, or behind the little window, were two men, and one's starting to hand me the files, and the other one's saying, yes, he can have that one, yes, he can have that one, yes, but no, he can't have this one. Now, this is in about 1990, and although I'd been told these files were declassified in the early 80s, I was still being refused access to them. These are files that are knotted up with pink ribbon, got big secret stamps on them, and I wonder if many of them had actually been opened at all since they were filed in 1945 or 6. Anyway, that intrigued me, and that, although we couldn't use much of that information in the series, that festering idea about what's in these files intrigued me, and I kept it in the back of my mind that one day I'd do more research. Now, as I began to read this, I found that special forces, which are what these guys are, had really a long history. Special forces went back to the Spartans. I mean, to the days of Sparta, where those 3,000 that were killed fighting Xerxes at Thermopylae were special forces. And through history, special forces have been people like sappers, whose job was to bring down castle walls. In the First World War, we had the Germans developed a group of stormtroopers that were elite troops. Special forces had a particular role. They were trained in a certain way. The British, of course, and the Australians in the First World War did not have designated special forces. But anyway, when the Second World War came upon us, you've got the British Expeditionary Force having to evacuate at Dunkirk. You've got lines and lines of men. They returned to Britain, fortunately, and Churchill realizes that there's not going to be a time in the immediate future where he can get back into Europe and take the war to the Germans. He's got the RAF bombing Germany, but he can't take ground operations forward. So he comes up with this idea of what he said, we've got to set Europe ablaze. And to do that, he established something called the Special Operations Executive. And these were principally men, women, taken from their countries, their home countries, trained and sent back, put back into France and Holland and Belgium and a range of countries right across Europe, to undertake guerrilla activities, to coordinate supply of weapons, to provide information and intelligence. And really one of the first operations, I mean, the British then started to realize the value of elite troops. And we probably know the story of the Long Range Desert Group and the SAS operating in North Africa. This is the attack on German behind German lines with specialist groups, and the Long Range Desert Group and the SAS evolved in that time in terms of specialist units. Now, one of the first operations that was successful was the assassination of Heinrich, which was Operation Anthropoid, on the 27th of May 1942, when trained operatives of SOE were able to kill him with an explosion in the streets as he drove to work. One of the early ones too was the attack on the heavy water plant in Norway that was at that time developing the potential for an atomic bomb or a weapon of equal destruction. And the operatives then were able to dismantle or destroy the machinery within that plant. And then they were able to sink a boat called the Hydro, which had already drums of heavy water ready to go to Germany. And this was a very successful operation. And it showed the capabilities of SOE operatives. Now, they had a range of operational areas. There was France and Poland and the Netherlands and Belgium, Italy, Yugoslavia. But one of the early successful operations was the destruction of the Gugapotamus Bridge in Greece. And this was a main rail link from Germany down through Greece, down to the ports to resupply German troops in North Africa. So as they went into this, you had groups of operatives working with SOE, being trained, resupplied. They were given weapons, radios. They were carrying on this guerrilla war, this underground war, right behind German lines, just as Hitler had hoped. Now, with the rapid advance of the Japanese, suddenly Japan's in the war, they're moving south, and they're rapidly coming towards Australia. They overtook Singapore. Singapore fell a couple of days before the first bombing of Darwin, and with it was the capture of the Australian 8th Division in that terrible disaster. Like Churchill, Australians, Curtin said, well, we've got to have an organisation that we can take the war back to Japan. How do we do it? So they formed something called Special Operations Australia and began training specialist units in this little cold, godforsaken place. This is down on Wilson's Promontory in a camp which quickly became unsuitable because men were going from the cold of this camp up to tropical areas. So they very quickly re-established training areas on Fraser Island and up in Cairns. But this training went on, and they were able to prepare men from early 1942 to undertake operations in somewhere north of Australia. Now, some of the early operations, the first terrible thing that happened to the Australians was that the Japanese came down, they landed in Dili in Timor, some 4,000 troops and light tanks. They quickly overcame the opposition with the Australians of Sparrow Force, which was a 2nd 40th Battalion, Tasmanians. But fortunately, the other unit of Australians there, the 2nd Independent Company, were able to escape into the hills and were able to continue that fight right through to the end of 1942. And some units they replaced, but some units came out in early 1943. They're very, very successful. At the same time, there were two disastrous small units. One was called Gulf Force that went into Ambon, and Lark Force that went into Rabaul and Kavieng. And again, they were overrun, captured, massacred, a terrible, terrible story. So these guys back on Timor, very fortunately, were able to put together a radio from bits and pieces, and they established a radio link to Australia, which allowed them to get resupplied and continue the fight. This radio, Winnie the War Winner, it was called. It's now on display in the War Memorial, but it's a terrific story. And they were drawn early in late 42 to 1943. Now, meanwhile, Special Operations Australia, said Special Unit, were training men. Their training continued. They were preparing men at this time for operations they weren't quite sure of. The first ones really went into Timor in late 1942, and this led to what became the disastrous Operation Legato. I mean, to be honest, it's one of those stories that's too painful to relate. But let's say it's a terrible chapter in the Z Special Unit history. More relevant and more successful was the Crite raid on Singapore. Now, many of us, if you know anything about the Z Special Unit, you'd probably know about the successful Crite raid, Operation Jaywick. That boat, the Crite, now sits down at the National Maritime Museum in Darling Harbour in Sydney. And it was extracted by a crazy old guy called Bill Reynolds, who was at the time in Singapore and had the job of looking at what he could destroy to stop the Japanese taking it. But he chose this boat and he thought, well, this may have a future in perhaps coming back on a raid. Well, it's a Japanese fishing boat. It might just slip through. Anyway, Bill Reynolds took the Crite, and he then sailed it to Ceylon, on the way picking up survivors of sinking ships, and finally arrived in Ceylon. Along the way, he met this guy called Ivan Lyon, who had also escaped from Singapore. I just want to point out a couple in that line. Lyon is the second from the left, and Bill Reynolds is the second from the right, and the one on the very far end at the right is Davidson. So Ivan Lyon and Bill Reynolds and others got together, and they came up with this sort of mad idea that why don't we sail the Crite back to Singapore, hop into some folding kayaks known as fold boats, and put limpet mines on ships, and let's go. So the next process was sort of training and selecting a party. They began with quite a few operatives, potential paddlers, and they set up a training camp at a place called Refuge Bay, which is in the mouth of the Hawkesbury River. And it's a very remote place in those days, accessed by water only, very popular today. But in that aerial photo, that little beach is where they landed. They had a cave behind the beach where they hid their kayaks during the day, and they had a camp up on the top of that cliff in the trees right on the top of the photo. Now, that's the camp as it was. In the recent past, I've been up that cliff and I've been into that area. You can find the area of the camp by those rocks, that rock cliff behind. And also I found, you can see in that bottom of the photo there, those white rocks marking the path. Some of those are still there in the bush, just as they were. They're not white anymore, but the area is completely overgrown. So anyway, they continued their training at Refuge Bay with their folding kayaks. Then the Crite came up to Refuge Bay and joined the training exercise. From there, it's a bit of a long story, but they sailed out from Refuge Bay all the way to Cairns, had engine trouble, and they replaced the engine in Cairns. But they then sailed around the top of Australia, around to Exmouth Gulf, where they prepared then for the raid on Singapore. So there's a picture here of the three officers that were involved. You've got at the top, at the left, you've got Page. In the middle, you've got Ivan Lyon, and at the bottom, you've got Davidson. So these were the three that sadly were lost in the second attempt at the Singapore raid in Operation Rimmel. So there's a final crew photo of the men. The one in the front row, second from right, with the tartan pants, is the only one that wasn't actually on the raid, but that's the complete crew. So on their way, they stopped off at this place called the House on the Hill, which was a large private home behind in the hills behind Cairns. That became their base for a while. But then they, as I said, they went on to Exmouth Gulf. They then set off on the trip to Singapore where they arrived on the 24th of September 1943. There's some of the operatives. That's in the background. That's Lyon. Now, the Crite took them to their base camp at Panjang Island, and there's a little beach there where they landed, and they hid their kayaks back in behind those that jungle right on the beach. And they stayed there for a little while, and then they started their operational paddle, which was about 50 k's, 30 odd miles to an area just off Singapore Harbour. Now, these were heavily laden boats they had. They had to carry all their stores, weapons. This particular boat's not one of the JWIG boats. You'll see it's got a little outboard motor on the back, but they're heavily laden. They've got all their food, water, everything they need has to go in these tiny kayaks. And so they set off and they landed on an island called Dongas, which was off Singapore Harbour. And it was here that Lyon was able to observe shipping and decide on his targets for the attack. The attack went in on the 26th of September, 1943. they sank or damaged 7 ships, totaling about 40,000 tons. Some of these ships were recovered, but once they'd undertaken the raid, they went back to Dongas, but they very quickly headed on their escape south because they had to rendezvous with the Crichton back on Pompong Island on the 2nd of October, which they did. They all successfully rendezvoused. They got back on the Crichton and they came back to Australia. They had one tiny moment of concern where they were approached at night by a Japanese ship while they were in the strait between Lombok and Bali. And this Japanese warship was hung off the back of this the Crichton. It couldn't defend itself in any way. They even looked, the operatives even thought Lyon had this idea of if they were caught, he'd take the Crichton next to the warship and blow themselves all up. I mean, that's how crazy he was. Just out of interest, this photo, this picture, it's a painting, of course, is in a frame, but it was given to me by a lovely ex-Z special man who had won it in a one of their get-togethers. And at the bottom, you'll see it's signed by Horry Young, and Horry was the radio operator on the Crichton. So it's quite a valuable painting and with a Horry Young signature. Anyway, just to quickly move it on, they returned to Australia on the 19th of October 1943, and these same group went on to undertake the unsuccessful Operation Rimmel a little later. Now, obviously, there's a lot happening all in different places. So we'll just jump to New Guinea for the next thing. The Japanese had landed along the north coast of New Guinea at Lae and Salamoa with the idea of capturing Port Moresby. We know of the Battle of the Coral Sea, the attempt of the Kokoda crossing, and the Australians, of course, were sent across Kokoda to hold the Japanese and push them back to the north coast. So that went on. The Japanese also landed at Milne Bay, and the Milne Bay landing was an attempt by the Japanese to establish an airfield. They were again defeated, and the Australians were able to contain that Japanese advance. Now, meanwhile, the coast watchers are working right around New Guinea, right around the Solomon Islands, in islands, and they were very, very successful. These are a typical coast watcher with some with his native troops. Admiral Halsey, who was Admiral Halsey near the American Navy, said that the coast watchers saved Guadalcanal and Guadalcanal saved the South Pacific. So that's how important these men were. Now, meanwhile, there's various operations going on, many of them hampered at the time by the lack of aircraft to fly them into forward bases and to resupply them. But one of them was a terrible operation that was effectively to establish a Coast Watch base out of Idapi, which is on the northern coast of New Guinea, right to on the western end of New Guinea, near the Dutch border, or the Dutch-New Guinea border as it was. This was called the Whiting Operation Whiting, and they left, and they, after an incredible journey through jungle and down rivers, and they arrived in the Idapi area, where unfortunately after a month of operations they were compromised by local natives. They were caught in a firefight. A number of the party were killed, but the fate of the party was this awful moment when Sergeant Sifflet is executed on the beach at Idapi. This photo was found on a dead Japanese, and it's become quite an iconic photo, but that's the moment of poor Sergeant Sifflet's death. Now, so by 1942, the Japanese then began withdrawing, owing to their reverses at Guadalcanal, and certainly they were forced back over the Kokoda Trail to the northern shoreline to Bunagona, and there the fighting took on a desperate case of trying to drive the Japanese from very, very well fortified positions. A lot of Australian casualties. Many of the Japanese were just driven into the sea and shot in the sea. However, what was lacking was the fact that the Australians had no intelligence on Japanese positions, particularly from Madang and along the coast. And they began inserting parties by Catalina on the rivers and pushing forward observation and intelligence gathering posts to find out what Japanese were doing, particularly in the Sepik area and behind Wewak. Now, Wewak became an important point because the Australians were pushing from the west back towards Wewak, in other words, going east. They're also pushing from the east going west towards Wewak. So, and Wewak was a very important and large Japanese base at the time. So it was decided that prior to the attempt to capture Wewak, they would send a party of 8 men ashore on an island about 5 miles off Wewak called Machu Island. And this became Operation Copper, to determine 2 things. One, whether there were heavy guns there. They expected there were 2 heavy naval guns there that could fire on any landing troops 5 miles away for the attack on Wewak. They also needed a Japanese prisoner. Now, this is the party of 8 men leaving, and they went on a HTML, which is a sort of a fast operational boat. They were key to many of the operations of these men being inserted into islands. Now, right from the start, this Operation Copper was a disaster. They set out in 4 2-man foal boats from the HTML, this boat we can see, and 3 of them were turned over in the surf as they tried to land on the island. They lost weapons. They had their radios submerged. They got their torch batteries wet. It was a disaster. Anyway, they got ashore. They quickly captured their prisoner, but the prisoner escaped and was able to yell out and warn the Japanese of the presence of this party. Meanwhile, the Japanese had found the 4 foal boats, so they knew they were dealing with 8 men. Now, suddenly these guys have got no radios, no contact at all with the outside world. They couldn't call back in the HTML that was patrolling, half a mile up the coast ready to pick them up, because everything was wet, including the batteries in their torches. Now, these guys were only sent there for 24, 48 hours. They had, a few dates. They had a few Horlicks tablets. They had nothing really to eat. They had weapons and ammunition, but they had nothing to eat. So it was decided that 4 of the 8 would get on logs, paddle out into the sea, and hopefully make contact with the HTML. Those 4 men were never seen again. That left 4. In the day or 2 after, 3 of those men were caught and captured by the Japanese, leaving 1 man, a wonderful guy called Mick Dennis, who, there he is in the middle, a tough little bugger. He only died a few years ago, and I went to his funeral down in Maroubra. But he was a lifesaver. He was a real tough little guy. He'd been in the independent companies. He'd fought the Japanese before. He knew what he was up against. And so he was there left on his own. And he's on an island of a few thousand Japanese. He spends 2 or 3 days having continual contacts with these Japanese, killing a few here, running, hiding, trying to escape. And he realizes, of course, this can't go on. So he finds a hatch cover off a ship, a large bit of floating timber hatch cover. And he sets out at night and he paddles across the 5 miles of filthy, muddy, crocodile, shark-infested water to land on the mainland. But of course, he's still behind Japanese lines. He then takes 3 or 4 more days, and he's only got his dates and his Horlicks tablets to keep him going. He's got a pair of shorts and a submachine gun and a fair bit of ammunition. But he fights his way to the west, and he finally meets up with Australians that are holding a line, which he knew about, probably 30, 40 miles away from where he set out, landed on the coast. So he had a horrendous journey. He's scratched, bloody, bitten by mosquitoes. He's got, he's starving, he's bearded, his clothes are in tatters. He finally arrives and he's able to give the Australian intelligence a lot of information about the Japanese position on Machu Island. So He then returned to his family in Sydney. There's his sister, who by chance was an Olympic swimmer in the 1932 Olympics. I think she got a gold medal in swimming. So it was a strong and healthy family. Now, the next one was this awful raid called Operation Rimmel. Lyon had come back with this bright idea that we should go back to Singapore, do it again. How can we do it? So he had, in the meantime, after Jaywick, he'd gone back to England, and he'd seen there these new secret kayaks that were actually submersible kayaks. They were submersible in that they could dive down, they could go along underwater, pop up with just their operatives' head above the water. And this would be a way he saw of delivering limpet mines, rather than paddling kayaks, to limpet mines to the Japanese ships in Singapore harbour. So after training on these special submersible boats known as Sleeping Beauties, he boarded with his team of 23 a submarine in Perth, and they were delivered up to the area of Borneo, where they were able to capture a junk. Now, Lyon's idea was, we'll capture the junk, we'll sail the junk to Singapore, much like we sailed the Crate to Singapore. This will be our stalking horse. We can sail so close to Singapore. We'll launch the submersible boats, do our raid, get back on the junk and sail away. Well, again, unlike Jaywick, everything went wrong. They captured the junk, they loaded all their supplies into the junk, and they set sail for Singapore. So they arrived at Singapore, and just hours before they were about to launch their attack, 3 hours, I think, before, they were approached by a native native patrol boat. Some edgy operatives on the junk fired on the police boat, killing 3 or 4 of a couple of the native policemen. But this really gave the game away. The Lyon's decision was, let's sink the junk. We don't want the Sleeping Beauties, secret kayaks, to fall into Japanese hands, and we'll paddle south, and we'll return to an island called Marapas Island, where they'd arranged for the submarine in 2 or 3 weeks' time to come and pick them up. So they all set out, paddled south in scattered groups. Meanwhile, the Japanese were on their trail, and very quickly they were caught up with, they were killed in various firefights, they were captured. At one point, they captured a junk and used that to sail further away. But in the end, of the 23, 13 were killed, drowned, lost, missing. 10 were captured, and in the final weeks of the war, in July 1945, those 10 men were executed by beheading after a trial in Singapore. And that was the end of Lyon and many of the men that had been on that first raid. Now, of course, other operational areas are being there's teams of operatives put into other areas. But what they next focused on was Borneo and the potential to assist the Australian landings at Balikpapan and Tarakan. And at this time, of course, the war had moved forward. MacArthur had told the Australians to mop up. He was just keen to get back to the Philippines. Halsey and the Navy were keen to attack the Japanese mainland. So the Australians were left with these back area operations. And so to insert the operatives into Borneo, and they wanted to go into the center of Borneo where the Japanese just didn't go. The Japanese were around the coasts. They started a process of parachute training, and they were inserted by parachute, and as was their supplies. Borneo had been an important place because this is major supplier of oil and rubber, also food. And so the Japanese were into that area very, very quickly after in their invasion south. They're there in 2 or 3 weeks. They put heavy restrictions on the people. They controlled labor. They re-educated the kids. It was they really took over in terms of extracting what they could out of that area. Now, so the idea was that back in Australia, the Special Operations Australia ZSU men were given a number of Liberator bombers, which they modified and into something they call 200 flight. And these bombers were fitted with special chutes for dropping parachute operatives, dropping resupply. This group of aircraft were then providing the support needed for the Borneo operations. There were 2 major operations in the Borneo area. There was AGAS and SEMIT, and here they were. The operatives were collecting the supplies, arming and training the local people, the Dayaks. Here's a group probably talking about how to attack a village or houses. And these native people, particularly the Dayaks, moved them around on the river. The river conditions were very dangerous, but they led them, they looked after them, they provided them with food, and certainly a pre-warning of any Japanese patrols that came into the area. But the Japanese did send patrols in, but they never ever returned. They were lost by either the Dayaks killing them, or they were tipped over by the Dayaks in rough water. They were drowned. The Dayaks loved the killing, because one of their big things was the taking of heads, and they'd kill Japanese, and the heads would then be hung in their longhouses. Now, this fight in Borneo continued, but right through the end of the war. Now, the very last raids that the Z Special were involved in was that there was one particular interesting raid where they had to extract the Sultan off a tiny island called Ternate Island, and they did that successfully. He was under house arrest by the Japanese, and they went in, took the family, and successfully relocated them. In fact, they were relocated to an area west of Toowoomba. There were other submarine patrols out of Perth, which were taking groups of operatives into areas just 2 at a time with one boat, into areas north of what was in the Celebes, into the area around the Philippines. There was even 2 raids on the Vietnamese coast, which I find quite extraordinary, that Australian operatives out of American submarines are taking a foalboat like you can see here. They've got a little outboard motor. They're put over the side. They maybe 5 miles off the coast. They use their outboard motor till they get a mile or 2 off the coast. Then they paddle in. And these operations, the second one was quite successful. It blew up a train. And although it did very little damage at the end of the day, it just created this situation for the Japanese where they didn't know where these people were going to come up from. So then the war is now coming to an end. The Germans were easily disarmed. I mean, that was a simple task. But in the case of the Japanese, their wartime empires stretched from Burma right across to the Central Pacific, right up to down to Timor, up to the Philippines, and certainly into Vietnam. So a lot of Japanese to both communicate with and to see surrender and have them surrender. And what this unit were then tasked to do was to go and find these Japanese in the jungle, try and tell them the war was over, bring them in, disarm them, and follow up any rogue groups and cover for that period after the surrender. Now, they were there even after the surrender of Japanese forces in, the Japanese war finished on the 15th of August 1945, but there were still operations going on into early October. Japanese were still being found, disarmed, pulled out of the jungle. But of course, there were Allied Australian casualties in that time. Men were killed in this terrible, terrible war. So They covered the surrender, and they helped re-establish the British control of these areas of Borneo. They were at one point tasked to try and help the prisoners of war after the terrible Sandakan death march, and they did find a couple, but they were not able to save them. So it's a long, and I'm trying to skip over as fast as I can about 84 separate raids. Just tell a story that is pretty much unknown, apart from the odd operation like Jaywick, as I said, in the Cripe. But the story, who would know that Australians were operating, blowing up trains in Vietnam? I find that interesting. So thank you for your interest and your attention. If anyone's interested in a copy of my book, Secret and Special, you'd like it in memory of someone. I've had a number of people say, look, could you write in memory of, Private or Corporal so-and-so, my great uncle or my father, and I can dedicate it and send it to you. The copies are $35 plus $15 for postage. But if you just email me at info@willdavies.net.au, I can make contact. I'll email you back and work out what you want said, and give you any bank details. So thank you for your time, for your interest in taking the time, and I'm grateful for the Royal Australian Historical Society to give me that access to you. Thank you.